So Julian of Norwich had visions, and in particular the vision of the thing in her hand, the quantity of a hazelnut. And in that vision, she wondered how this thing that represents all that is held together, because it seemed so fragile and insubstantial that it ought to just dissolve into nothing. And Julian had reason to wonder if the world might just dissolve into nothing, that it might come completely undone and come apart. She lived in a tumultuous time. The 14th century in Europe, and indeed the rest of the world, was a hard time for humanity. The century began, this is before Julian was born, but it would have affected her life, with famine. A massive volcano in another part of the world exploded and caused climate change, of all things, and led to several years of unseasonable cold and rain, leading to the failure of crops, which then led to famine. It is estimated that in Northern Europe, which would include England, where Julian was later born, 5 to 12% of the entire population died. That certainly would have been fresh in the memory of people in Julian's time. So the century began that way, but it continued to get even more tumultuous. In 1337, the 100 Years' War broke out between England and France, lasting from 1337 to 1453. So for a little over 100 years, England was at war with France. All of that war was fought in the territory that is now France, but would have affected the way people in Julian's world in Norwich would have seen things, as there was this perpetual war and regular drafting of men to go and fight in France. So there was perpetual war. There was also political turmoil. In 1381, there was a Peasant Revolt. The peasants revolted out of anger at the way they were being governed. They took London. They beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the head of the Catholic Church in England, and also an important political official in the king's government. The king escaped. The peasants also took over Norwich, where Julian lived, and for a time it was unclear how things were going to go, but eventually the king and his allies and army put down the Peasant Revolt, and a very unsettling and politically tumultuous period. Besides the Peasant Revolt, there was other political turmoil. Two of the kings of England in the 14th century were deposed. Edward II, who was king from 1307 to 1327, was deposed and possibly murdered. Richard II, who was king from 1377 to 1400, was also deposed and likely starved to death in a cell. So political turmoil was very much a part of the world in which Julian lived. Things did indeed seem to be coming apart in all sorts of ways. There was also church conflict. For a time, the Pope moved from Rome to Avignon, France, which was unsettling because, of course, the Pope is supposed to be in Rome. And during a period from 1309 to 1377, the Pope was in Avignon, and that was called the Babylonian captivity because the Pope was in exile from Rome, where he should be. Also, during that time, in 1378, the Roman Church was divided between two men who claimed to be Pope, as different factions vied for control of the church. For 68 years, there were two popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon. And then for a short time, when people tried to make a compromise that did not work, there were 3 men claiming to be pope, which was, as you can imagine, bewildering and confusing and disillusioning to pious Christians of the time, leading to further turmoil in the church in England. A professor of theology at Oxford University, John Wickliffe, began teaching and arguing for changes in the church that were against the official church teaching, which led to him being fired from his position in Oxford in 1381. But his teachings and his followers continued to run around England teaching things contrary to the church, in many ways foreshadowing Martin Luther's rebellion against the church and a reformation of the church 2 centuries later. There was also changing in fashion in the 14th century. Over the period of the century, skirts kept rising and rising and rising until towards the end, some skirts were so high you could see the shape of the buttocks. Although this was not women's fashion, this was men's fashion, as their hems began to go higher and higher, revealing more and more of the hose that they wore underneath the skirts. And even that was unsettling to many people who wanted to maintain classic morality. In 1362, there was a great flood in the area of Norwich, in which there was much devastation. And then, most consequential, in the middle of the 14th century, from 1348 to 1351, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, came through Europe, decimating the population. Nearly half of the city of Norwich, where Julian lived, died in that first round of plague. Nearly a half in a 3-year span. The plague returned in 1361, killing another 23%, and came back again in 1374, killing another 13%. Some have speculated that during one of those plagues, Julian may have lost close family. Given that she was a woman, it is very likely that she might have been married as a young woman and maybe even had some children. But by the time we see her later, she does not have a husband or children. And so some people have speculated that maybe she lost family in one of those rounds of plague. But you can imagine how devastating that was to the social fabric and the economic fabric of the time. Much of that sounds very contemporary. Political turmoil, church turmoil, climate change, and we are ourselves in a season of pandemic. Nothing as serious as the bubonic plague of the 14th century, but serious enough to be unsettling and to make us wonder how we can hold it together when so much seems to be coming apart. So that is the historical context in which Julian lived. It was a hard time. But she had this vision that she held on to, a vision of something the quality of a hazelnut, small, insubstantial, but held together by God, the fact that God made it, God loves it, and God keeps it. In the next video, in the next meditation, we will look specifically at we will begin looking at those 3 parts of the vision. God made it, God loves it, God keeps it. In the next video, specifically, God made it. And I invite you, before watching the next video, to see if you can find your own thing, the quantity of a hazelnut. Something the size of a hazelnut. It doesn't need to be an actual hazelnut. Anything this size will do, a marble, a stone. If nothing else, you can wad up tightly a half sheet of paper and make a paper ball to hold in the palm of your hand. But I invite you, before the next video, to come back with a hazelnut that you can use as we meditate on the promise that God made it, God loves it, God keeps it.